This talk is sponsored by the Honors College, the Humanities Advancement Board, the English Department, and the Department of History. I'm very happy to introduce this evening our guest speaker, Stephen Kantrowitz, who is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Among many other publications, Professor Kantrowitz is the author of More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic, 1829 to 1889, which was published in 2012, and Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, which was published in 2000. The latter book, a pioneering study on Tillman that captures the racist and authoritarian aspects of this figure, like no other study accomplishes in my view, will form the basis of his talk tonight on Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. Please welcome Professor Kantrowitz.
Who was Ben Tillman? This plaque tells part of the story. It's on the State House grounds, on the statue I just showed you. There's little to quarrel with here. Ben Tillman was a husband, a governor, a long-serving senator, patriot and statesman also here, or honorifics, but this is a statue after all, and a pretty big one. But why Ben Tillman on the State House grounds in Columbia? What distinguished him from the 10 or 20 other South Carolina politicians whose bronzes could have graced that plinth? There's a clue on the plaque on the other side. Now this one needs a little lining out. Loving them, he was the friend and leader of the common people. He taught them their political power and made possible for the education of their sons and daughters. What does it mean to say that Tillman loved the common man, that he was their friend and leader, that he taught them their political power? It might mean this. Someone thought it did. I found this collection in the found this photo in the collections of the Library of Congress, along with all the formal portraits of Tillman in the Senate and as a statesman. And somebody really did think that this captured Tillman because they made it up. You can see here, if you couldn't see already, that it's a fake. Someone cut out Tillman's formal portrait and pasted it onto this wagon. Why? To make sense of all this, we need to step back a bit and find out who Ben Tillman was, where he came from. We need to find out who that common man was, and in what sense Tillman loved, befriended, and led him. We need to dig a little into the question of what political power is, and what it's for, in whose name it operates, and in whose interests. My talk tonight's called Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, and so you may have some sense of where I'm going with all this. I wrote a book with that same title. I have a friend who advised me, though, and I will advise you that if you have a deep and terrible secret, something that would ruin you if it came out, and you want to sleep easy at night, just publish that secret in a history book, and you can rest easy. But I did spend a lot of time in Ben Tillman's papers, here at Clemson and down at Columbia, and newspapers and letters and pamphlets and speeches from the 1850s all the way to the 19-teens. So I've seen and read a lot that, fortunately for you, I don't have time to say this evening. My hope is that in the next 40 minutes or less, I can explain a little bit about who Ben Tillman was and why he mattered, how he made history, what kind of history he made, and what it means for us today. Before I dive into the story, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the Organization of American Historians under whose auspices I'm giving this lecture. I want to say thank you to Michael Mang and the History Department for inviting me. I want to say thank you to the wonderful graduate students I met today. And I especially want to say thanks to my old friend Vernon Burton, one of the best historians, the finest teachers, and the most committed and admirable people I know. His kindness and generosity have taught me just as much as his scholarship. 25 years ago, when I was extremely provincial and wet behind the ears graduate student, I cold called him to ask about Ben Tillman, and he responded by inviting me to his mother's house in '96. And he and Georgianne fed me and put me up, and we began a conversation, and that conversation has not stopped, and I'm so grateful to you, Vernon. Ben Tillman was born on top of the world of Edgefield, South Carolina in 1847, a time and a place where white society weighed wealth and power in acres and slaves. This is South Carolina in 1860, shaded to represent the proportion of each county that was enslaved. As you can see, Ben Tillman's world was made by the labor of slaves. He reached manhood just as that world forever crumbled in the aftermath of slave emancipation and the dawn of Reconstruction. He spent the rest of his life fighting to restore whatever could be restored of the world he'd lost. A world that united white men by their common interest in freedom for themselves and slavery for the slave's black majority. A world that pulled white men together by their shared mastery in law and custom of their households and their legislature. A world where the wealthy and powerful were almost entirely slaveholders, and where it was hard to imagine wealth and power without slaves. There were a little under 60,000 free families in South Carolina in 1860. More than 25,000 of them owned slaves, 46%. And when any of them, threadbare, opulent, or aspiring, imagined wealth, imagined success, imagined prominence, the status of the slaveholder was what they imagined. If slavery disappeared, so would the source of that wealth. And African Americans, they feared, would then become at best a burden and at worst a deadly threat to white lives and white prosperity. You might say that white men from Tillman on down shared a common racial view, one we could call white supremacist. Except they didn't need to call it that. They didn't need to assert that white people were superior. Every signpost in these men's world assured them that that was so. The law of slavery made white men collectively the masters of black people collectively. The law presumed that black people were slaves. It forbade them from learning to read or from meeting in private. Challenges to slavery, revolts or conspiracies, real or imagined, had to be put down mercilessly, lest the minority, 300,000 white South Carolinians, lose control of the majority, 400,000 slaves. Since the colonial era, laws have divided the enslaved from the merely indentured, defining only people of African descent as enslavable, promising the descendants of Europeans that they would never fall so low, and encouraging them to invest themselves in that crucial distinction, being white. By the time that Ben Tillman inherited his world, the separation had hardened into rigid social strata. Slaves and poor whites violated the rules all the time, of course, but that was the point. When they traded or socialized together, they were breaking the law. Only two things could threaten this system. One was the threat of slave revolt, always lurking just off stage as South Carolinians enacted their daily rituals. The other was the possibility that the non-slaveholding parts of the country, having turned their backs on slavery, would become overtly hostile to it and throw the world into economic chaos, perhaps even encourage or support a revolt of the slaves. By the time Ben Tillman was born in 1847, the second set of fears was becoming real. A small interracial abolition movement proposed immediate liberation. It included radicals who promoted revolt, and even a wild-eyed few who insisted that black and white were equal in ability and should be equal citizens. Those ideas were wildly unpopular, even in the deep north, but they changed the regional conversation about slavery. In the year of Ben Tillman's birth, in fact, a political party emerged in the north whose purpose was to block slavery's expansion beyond the states where it already existed. And so it's no accident the slogan white supremacy emerged in this era. It defended the already well-known idea that the world was divided into races, that they stood in a hierarchy, and that whites belonged at the top and blacks at the bottom. As a slogan, as a rhetorical point, as a political program, white supremacy sought to maintain and bolster that hierarchy. It reflected the fear, or the perception, that African Americans were slipping the bonds of slavery and might establish themselves as free and equal citizens. This was why even moderate anti-slavery positions terrified slaveholders. This was why the election in 1860 of the moderate anti-slavery man Abraham Lincoln seemed so threatening. Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but Lincoln also called slavery an evil and hoped to block its expansion. Lincoln acknowledged white supremacy. He defensively asserted that opposition to slavery did not make him a racial egalitarian, and he wasn't. Not in 1860 anyway. In any case, Lincoln did not dare challenge white supremacy in the North, where he was looking to get elected. But there was no defensiveness about white supremacy or ambivalence about slavery among the Confederate leadership. We can hear white supremacy's highest eloquence in the words of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, when he explained the bedrock principle of the new Confederate Constitution in 1861. The assumption of the equality of races was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Abandoning the notion that all men were created equal, clarifying that it did not belong to black people, was a huge relief. The slaveholders took their new government to war with the United States, gambling that they could create the future their vice president imagined, a future where slavery and white supremacy were once again safe, secure, and self-evident. But the slaveholders lost that war, and with it they lost slavery. Ben Tillman, born to be a man of power in the world of slavery, reached manhood at 18 in 1865 in a world that he had never imagined possible, a world that had abolished slavery, where black workers could win a contract and a wage, soon a world in which they could not legally be whipped. By 1867, South Carolina's black men were voting. By 1868, their revolutionary political might reshaped the state's politics, rewrote its constitution, and reconfigured what whiteness and blackness meant in law and in practice. We call that revolution Reconstruction, and it was many things all at once. But for Ben Tillman and men like him, it was a world turned upside down. A world in which African Americans could presume to demand better wages, education, and equal enforcement of the laws, and for the first time, the right to bodily integrity, to be secure in their persons, to have assaults on them or their property redressed by law, not to live in the shadow of the whipping post or the auction block. For the Tillman household, it meant a world in which they'd been robbed of their right to control the lives and labors of the people on whom they depended to till and harvest their crops. In fact, those people now cast the votes that determined who governed Ben Tillman's world. The Tillmans couldn't win at the ballot box, which meant they couldn't control the terms of black agricultural labor or the enforcement of their will as law. But they believed that this new order was fundamentally, essentially wrong. Ben Tillman's older brother George put it this way: the land, labor, and lives of the colored races are by common consent articles of free trade among Caucasians everywhere. Since the laws of Reconstruction and tallies at the ballot box said otherwise, the Tillmans and their allies believed violence was the only alternative. Intimidation, threats, coercion, assault, murder, even mass murder, all designed to return black people to subjugation. The Ku Klux Klan became the first wave of organized vigilante violence. The hooded terrorists murdered black office holders and activists, barred black men from voting, punished those who did. In 1871 and 1872, federal forces put the Klan down. But despite this, soon Reconstruction began to collapse, partly of its own contradictions, partly because of a brutal national oppression, and partly through the persistent violence of former slaveholders. This moment of white supremacist reassertion was where Ben Tillman entered the story, a man in his mid-20s. In 1873, he joined a local company of white vigilantes, the Sweetwater Saber Club, they called themselves, which terrorized black Republican leaders. They backed up their violence with economic reprisals, refusing to sign or fulfill labor contracts with black activists. By 1876, these vigilantes had become the armed wing of a political movement that demanded one-party rule by an all-white Democratic leadership. In this movement, Ben Tillman played a key role. In July 1876, an all-black company of the state militia paraded through the town of Hamburg and were confronted by two young wealthy white men in a buggy. The militiamen finally stood aside and let the men pass, but the white men considered this all the provocation they needed. 4 days later, they and their friends donned uniforms of red shirts and rode armed into Hamburg to demand the militiamen's rifles. When the men refused, the vigilantes laid siege to their drill room. They used a cannon to knock down its walls. In the initial attack, they killed or wounded a few of the militiamen, but about 30 were captured. Ben Tillman knew what the stakes were and what had to be done. 40 years later, at a reunion of his comrades, he explained, "The leading white men of Edgefield had determined to seize the first opportunity the Negroes might offer to provoke a riot and to teach the Negroes a lesson by having the whites demonstrate their superiority by killing as many of them as was justifiable." That was what they did. Having provoked a conflict and captured their enemy, Tillman and his compatriots selected 5 black men they deemed particularly objectionable. One by one, they called the captives out and shot them dead. One white man died in the struggle, a planter's son named Keith Merriweather. Over the years, Ben Tillman and his allies heralded young Merriweather as the martyr of the struggle for white supremacy. And in 1916, they erected this monument to his memory in Hamburg, what's now North Augusta. This monument celebrates young Merriweather's sacrifice, as the monument puts it, in maintaining those civic and social institutions which the men and women of his race had struggled through the centuries to establish. Merriweather was a fallen patriot in the cause of white supremacy. Tillman and his red shirts rode through the summer and fall of 1876. To their chagrin, they arrived too late to take part in the massacre of 30 men in a swamp near Ellington. But 2 of the men in Tillman's unit captured and murdered a black Republican state senator, Simon Coker, who'd come to investigate. On election day that year, 1876, Ben Tillman manned a local polling place in Edgefield. A freedman named Robert Chandler tried to cast a ballot for the Republicans that day, and he found Ben Tillman and his friends whooping and hollowing, warning him that if he come any closer, he would come through blood. Through intimidation, violence, and fraud, Tillman's red-shirt Democrats claimed victory. Their victory became part of the crisis of 1876, a nationally contested election that Republicans and Democrats finally resolved, in part, by giving the presidency to the Republicans, while allowing Democrats to gain control of the last 3 states with Reconstruction Republican governments. One of them was South Carolina. Federal troops withdrawn, the Republican Party in disarray, force and fraud sanctioned as politics unusual. Ben Tillman and the state's other white landowners, their landowners and planters, secured white supremacy. Or did they? Not so fast. African Americans did not stop asserting their rights under the Constitution. They did not stop seeking white allies. And it turned out that here and there, those allies might still exist. White supremacy was a fine-sounding slogan. It flattered the prejudices and the fears of many white men and women. But its promise of superiority of all whites over all blacks was not the same thing as prosperity, or even subsistence, for all whites. The men who retook power in 1877 entered from the same economic echelons as those who ruled in 1860. They cared mostly for their own power and their own prosperity. They would bend in the direction of lower white men, but only just as far as they had to. And as they adjusted to a regional and national economy that was shifting beneath their feet, they stumbled in ways that clarified just how little they cared about poor white men. The post-1877 Democrats' ties to banks, railroads, and a new merchant class inflicted new flavors of peonage on whites as well as blacks. More seriously, Democrats changed the state's fence laws. These had once allowed poor men to range their livestock freely, one of the few ways a landless family could build wealth. Under the new law, the burden fell on them to fence in their hogs and cattle. This made it impossible for landless men to keep livestock. By the early 1880s, some poor white men were burning rich men's fences. And they were threatening to leave the Democratic Party. This meant one way or another turning to the only other power center in the state, the Republican Party, now supported almost entirely by African Americans. White supremacy was hard work. The boulder never quite made it all the way up the hill. White supremacy insisted that all white men shared one common interest, the interest in being white, not black, and in enforcing their common superiority over all African Americans. But the minimum wages of whiteness did not include actual wealth, or even a modest subsistence. White supremacy did not buy ham, cornmeal, or whiskey, let alone land, let alone legislatures, let alone protection from boom and bust capitalism. The wages of whiteness could plummet so low as to tempt some white men to seek other arrangements. In 1882, a disaffected white Democrat named Hendricks McLean organized an interracial challenge to Democratic rule under the banner of the National Greenback Party and sought alliance with the state Republican, most of them black. When these white men took their campaign into the upstate that fall, it turned out that their whiteness did not protect them from white supremacy. In fact, they confronted some of the same violence that black Republicans had faced 6 years before. Red shirts raided greenback rallies, murdered a white greenback congressional candidate. At Lancaster that fall, the red shirts repeated the violence of Hamburg, targeting black Republicans who dared to assert themselves and make coalition with the greenbackers. Democrats won that year, but they learned a hard lesson about the fragility of their victory in 1876. They would have to keep winning it over and over again. Ben Tillman rode his acres in those years, keeping his laborers hard at work, but sometimes turning his eye on doings in Columbia. And a decade after he rode with the Red Shirts in 1876, he decided to save the Democratic Party by saving white supremacy from itself. Tillman understood that the state's leading Democrats were sitting on a powder keg. They had no plan to secure the futures of most white men except the ritual intonation of the slogan, white supremacy. This meant sooner or later those men would rebel, and when they did, they might dismiss white supremacy as any kind of answer, and again turn to the state's black majority for help, and then the battle of Reconstruction would have to be fought all over again and again, and who could say that the Red Shirts and the Democrats would win every time? So Ben Tillman set about remaking the Democratic Party from within. He began what he called the Farmers' Movement, which reframed white supremacy in terms of the independence, prosperity, and power of a class he called the farmers. This meant rich men and poor men. It explicitly meant white men. In this vision, black men and women who worked the land were laborers, not farmers. In 1890, amidst hard times, Tillman wrote this movement to the governorship. He declared this a victory for the common man. He did not need to say white man, that was implicit. He did need to say common, because he meant his rule to stand for the broad mass of farmers rather than distant and detached elites in Charleston and Columbia. People Tillman used to call broken down old politicians and superannuated bourbon aristocrats. These men did not know what the state needed. Their colleges were schools for dandies. The Citadel in particular was a military dude factory. That was how he came to champion the Farmers College, an upstate institution to serve white farmers and their sons. That was how Tillman came to champion the creation of what became Clemson, and finally to urge Thomas Green Clemson to endow it. But the Farmers College was a minor element of Tillman's campaign against the men he called the aristocrats, the enemies of the farmers. The key to his own rise was his ability to turn every contest into a morality pledge that pitted the honest sons of the soil against two sets of enemies. Above sat an effete class of do-nothing politicians. Below stood a restive and dangerous mass of former slaves. Only Tillman could guide the ship between those rocks. He positioned himself as the rough-spoken truth-teller who was not afraid to call these enemies what they were. He loved to curse, to see his opponents' shocked reactions. His rhetoric was violent and reckless. He constantly accused his enemies of corruption, incompetence, and effeminacy, then slipped away when they demanded proof. This never seemed to hurt him. In fact, every barb his enemies threw at him in return enhanced his stature. The Democratic elites he faced off with hated him, but they also disdained him. They could not help describing him as a poor white, a tacky, a wool hat, a man without culture or refinement. The wealthy and well-read Tillman leaned into this. He described himself as a backwoods man and a farmer only, but he was far, far from poor. He was rich, in fact. His elite enemies railed at his lack of polish and finesse. Tillman reveled in their scorn, and he profited from it. Their contempt and condescension, in fact, became his platform and his pitchfork. In 1890, Tillman won the governorship, driving establishment Democrats to distraction, even causing some of them to make a fatal last-ditch choice to appeal to the black majority for support. They failed, staining themselves as traitors to their race. Tillman won and became a tribune of the farmers and the common man. Forever after, he reminded voters whose commitment to white supremacy was real and whose was only expedient. Tillman took power as a new kind of violence swept the region. Lynching. Small groups, large posses, sometimes entire towns came out to butcher someone, usually a black man, to burn them alive, to torture them to death, to mutilate them and string them up, while claiming to act in defense of their communities and in service to a higher law. Sometimes they claimed the black male victims had affronted white womanhood, although as the intrepid journalist Ida B. Wells began pointing out almost immediately, mobs only made such claims in a minority of cases, and when they did, they tested them only by torture. Much more often, they mobbed black men for stepping over lines of economic, political, and social aspiration, for standing up to an employer's demands, for seeking to act independently, for challenging the social order of white supremacy. The accusation of sexual assault was generally a lie, but it did important work. Political leaders knew that white men's sense of mastery and authority rested in their authority over the lives, labors, and bodies of their wives and children. They also knew that the post-Civil War economy made that mastery a thin thread for many white men, whether they worked in the fields or now in the mills. But Democrats had no economic program for improving that situation, so they emphasized how much worse things could be. They suggested, and it was a new suggestion in the 1880s, that what black men sought through politics was not just control over the state's government, but over its white people generally, and in specific, over its white women. The legend of the sexually rapacious black man emerged as a campaign strategy, one that connected African American aspirations to equality as citizens with sexual designs that if refused would lead black men to rape. In fact, the simple phrase social equality stopped meaning what it said and started meaning black men having sex with white women. Since white supremacy could not contemplate the possibility that this could be consensual, it could only be rape. At least 170 lynchings took place in South Carolina between 1880 and 1940, and nearly a third of those occurred in the 1890s. In Edgefield and the counties around it, lynching outnumbered legal executions. This could have been a problem for a new governor seeking to demonstrate his mastery over the state and its politics. And indeed, Ben Tillman began his term as governor in 1890 insisting on the rule of law, not the rule of the mob. He had his secretary write to a black man in Georgetown that while white supremacy is best for both races, Tillman believed that the colored people should have the protection of the law as fully as other citizens. But as lynching persisted, Tillman came to understand he must not stand so squarely against it. By 1892, his answer was his lynching pledge, that while he opposed lynching in principle, he would, quote, willingly lead a mob in lynching a Negro who had committed an assault upon a white woman. Willingly lead a mob. In later years, Tillman elaborated on this view in a speech on what he called the race problem. The problem, in other words, of black freedom and constitutional equality. This speech, which he gave to audiences around the country and around the world, argued that race antagonism was a basic force in human history. Races were real, eternal, and unequal. Each sought domination, but only one deserved to rule. Civilization was a white Christian accomplishment. Black people might acquire what he called a little of the veneer of civilization, but on the whole, they could never be more than laborers. Reconstruction's great evil had been promising them more than that. In gaining freedom and the right to vote, he said, black men tasted blood. They sought domination first of political life, then of white women. Tillman explained, the poor African became a fiend, a wild beast, seeking whom he may devour, lurking around to see if some helpless white woman can be murdered or brutalized. That was why, Tillman explained, he opposed even a whiff of racial equality. As he put it, we realize what it means to allow even so much as a trickle of race equality to break through the dam. He often sounded angrier than that, so I apologize in advance for repeating the words he used when President Theodore Roosevelt entertained Booker T. Washington in the White House in 1906, but I won't censor Ben Tillman or pretend he used words less cruel than he did. And to understand his career, you have to understand how he sounded. Tillman swore that Roosevelt's invitation to Washington, quote, will necessitate our killing 1,000 niggers in the South before they will learn their place again. More than necessitate. This wasn't a matter of cold calculation, Tillman claimed. It was a matter of racial instinct. White men, real white men, were more than a match for bestial black men, for savagery. Their instincts for racial domination came to the fore. If you scratch the white man too deep, Tillman told his colleagues in the U.S. Senate, you will find the same savage whose ancestry used to roam wild in Britain when some female of their acquaintance or one of their daughters had been ravished, and they were as wild and cruel as any tiger of the jungle. This version of white supremacy was that it was bred in the bone. It was as real as race itself. In a way, it was race. This was how white men were and why they must and should and will always rule. But Tillman knew better. He knew that many, many white men wanted something more than the wages of whiteness. His own campaigns acknowledged they had a proper bone to pick with their leaders who'd failed to help them achieve prosperity. But Tillman had no answers. The establishment of a farmers' college might help a small number of farmers do their work more efficiently, but it would not solve the crisis of the international cotton economy, halt the slide in the price per pound of cotton, prevent the nation from falling into catastrophic financial crises and depressions. None of Tillman's other efforts as governor were any more useful. But perhaps it's not surprising that in 1894 he set his sights on another office, the U.S. Senate. That year was a turning point in the history of white supremacy as well, for it also held a referendum on a project dear to Tillman's heart, whether to call a convention to write a new state constitution for South Carolina, one whose avowed purpose was to strip the vote from as many black men as could be done within the strictures of the 15th Amendment. The problem with this was simple. The amendment forbade disfranchisement on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In order to take the vote away from black men, South Carolina would have to come up with devious expedients: poll taxes, property qualifications, literacy tests, along with escape hatches for white men, flexible criteria like understanding in place of literacy, for example, which could be administered by friendly white officials. But many, many white men understood that the effect of such a constitution would be their effective disfranchisement. The escape hatches would not open for them all. And so the 1894 referendum on the Constitutional Convention spurred a backlash, one that very nearly prevented the convention from being called at all. The state's remaining black voters, clustered in the Low Country, opposed it vigorously. So did a large number of white voters. For Tillman, a frighteningly large number. In the end, Tillman's allies pushed the convention through by a narrow margin against vigorous white as well as black opposition in a statewide referendum marked by fraud and violence. And when the convention sat, it did just what Tillman envisioned. It set such dramatic impediments in the way of African American voting that over the next 30 years, the number of votes cast by black men in South Carolina plummeted almost to zero. White turnout fell as well. White supremacy was not a fact, but it was more than a slogan. Tillman painted it as a political identity and an imperative worldview that should include all white men, but need not. White men who were willing to do political business with black men were not really white, it turned out. A man who did this was, in Tillman's world, not a genuine white man, or simply a white Negro. How could this be? What happened to the racial instinct that was supposed to be driving this conflict? Beneath the rhetoric of racial instinct and white men fierce as tigers in the jungle lay a very different understanding. Tillman's understanding that maintaining a socially and economic order required careful thought and planning, including in the planning and conduct of violence. Listen again to Tillman describing the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. Quote, "The leading white men of Edgefield had determined to seize the first opportunity that the Negroes might offer them to provoke a riot and teach the Negroes a lesson by having the whites demonstrate their superiority by killing as many of them as was justifiable." So this was not irrepressible racial instinct, the work of the blood set aboil by black presumption. This was the work of cold-blooded assassination and murder, meant to punish and deter, to secure power not for the catch-all white men, but for the leading white men of Edgefield, a particular faction of a particular party. Tillman frequently and openly acknowledged that his violence was purposeful and considered. "We have done our level best to prevent blacks from voting," he said. "We have scratched our heads to find out how we could eliminate the last one of them. We stuffed ballot boxes. We shot them. We are not ashamed of it." That was in the United States Senate in 1900. But Tillman could sell this contradiction, white men fierce as tigers, deliberate cold-blooded murder, is a testament to his political genius. It is also a testament to his ability to embody the contradiction itself, to rant and rave, curse and threaten, to gain the name Pitchfork Ben for threatening to stick that implement in Grover Cleveland's something or other, to get into a fistfight on the floor of the U.S. Senate with his fellow senator from South Carolina. Tillman seemed to be the white wild man he described, the tribune of the lower orders, the crude embodiment of Southern white racial instinct. Even Tillman's most bitter and sophisticated foes, people with a great deal at stake in understanding who he really was, seemed ready to accept this. Take Theodore Roosevelt, for example. TR hated Tillman, but he understood Tillman's white supremacist violence as a kind of, quote, homicidal mania, a product of what Roosevelt incorrectly asserted were Tillman's origins among the lower order of whites. Roosevelt, the Northern progressive, shared many of Tillman's racist views. What's more striking is how many others who did not share those views also assumed that the myth of Tillman's origins was true. Take African-American activist and writer Kelly Miller. Miller wrote that Tillman had unleashed lower-class passions that an older generation had held in check. He wrote, Tillman had been the first to pitch the poor whites against the Negro in fierce and bitter array, for he understood the dynamic power of hatred. Was this a matter of political calculation or a matter of origins? Like Roosevelt, Miller leaned toward the latter explanation. He described Tillman as the embodiment and expounder of the rule of the nether whites. Perhaps it's not surprising people continue to describe Tillman this way, continue to hand him his pitchfork as though it belonged to him, as though its significance were self-evident. It was easier to see violent white supremacy as a natural feature of the landscape than it was to analyze it as a political program and a social argument. It was easier to make Jim Crow an inevitable result of emancipation than to confront how much hard work of violence and degradation went into creating that social order. The leading Southern historian of the early 20th century, Ulrich B. Phillips, described the central theme of Southern history as, quote, a common resolve indomitably maintained that it is and shall be a white man's country. Ben Tillman was not around to read those words, but had he been, he would have smiled. He couldn't have said it better himself. He'd won. The promises that Tillman tried to keep, especially the promise to keep African Americans from achieving any measure of political or social equality, profoundly injured our democracy. And the promises he broke injured it too, like the promise he would amend the Constitution without sacrificing the votes of white men. Tillman tried to make white people so afraid of equality they would cut themselves off at the knees in order to prevent it. And by the time some white people realized what was happening, by the time voters mobilized in 1894 to stop the Constitutional Convention, it was too late. Political and social equality in the United States were dealt a mighty blow during Tillman's career, a blow from which it took generations of struggle to recover. Indeed, it's a past we have not fully confronted, much less overcome. It might be a good time to look at our democracy and think about what we can learn from the success of this aristocratic tyrant who posed so successfully as the rough tribune of the people. He pretended to be the white people's friend, and many white people were so hungry for a friend that they bought it. But whatever love Tillman had for plain white people was mixed with disdain, and always came second to his fear of black Americans' aspirations and his defense of his own privileges. There's a reason someone, There's a reason someone made this picture. Either they bought into Tillman's false version of himself and wanted to represent it, or they knew it was false, but they needed it anyway, much as Tillman himself did. People often hold out Clemson as evidence that whatever his failings, Tillman really did have white men's interests at heart. It's on that plaque on the State House statue, for example, as the evidence, the only evidence, that he loved his white people. But consider this. In 1892, when Tillman was governor, South Carolina was offered a significant amount of money under the Second Rural Act to fund agricultural education. Under the terms of that act, in states where the funds were to be divided between white and black institutions, like South Carolina's, the division was to be according to the proportion of the state's population. That meant about 57% of South Carolina's money would go to Claflin, and the substantial remainder to Clemson. Tillman would not accept that division. Before I would accept that money and give 2/3 of it to the Negroes, I will let it stay in the treasury, he insisted. He was more deeply committed to white supremacy as a principle than to the needs and lives of actual people, even his beloved white people, his common man. And if he were alive today, if he were standing where I am, if he were among us tonight, women and men of all origins and backgrounds, sitting together as equal members of the community, he would tear this all down brick by brick, rather than let it stand as a place where we can talk together about the past and imagine a future. To the precise extent that Clemson hews to a vision of democracy and equality, to the precise extent that our nation does, they are repudiations of Tillman's vision. We are repudiations of Tillman's vision. And to imagine that he was the enemy of black folk, but still somehow the friend of white folk, that's to hand him his pitchfork all over again, to accept the lie he loved to tell and leave it for yet another generation to try to undo the damage. A century ago, people struggling to make a better world needed a better friend than Ben Tillman. We still do. Thank you.